Welcome, everybody. As the Dean of the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, I'd like to welcome you to our annual event for the community, Brain Matters, where we try to take research findings that are going on at the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences and try to convey them, their import to our everyday lives. And so we're glad you're here. Sorry the weather's so terrible. I think we had a few more people signed up. Probably. But so anybody wants to come forward, please do. But we're happy that you're here, and we're thrilled. We have research in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. We have research in essentially 3 different areas. We have research going on in basic fundamental neurobiology. That's how the nerves in the brain are wired up and how their cells and how the chemicals are working. We have speech, language, and hearing sciences focused on speech and language and hearing and the disorders of those. And we have psychology, and that's what we're going to emphasize today, which is the study, obviously, of human behavior in all of its forms. And our psychology group does a studies diverse topics in psychology, from social psychology, interactions among people, developmental psychology, how children develop, how they learn, how they grow, and how adults develop and grow and age, in fact. We have cognitive psychology. That's how we think, how our memory works, how our attention works, and things like that. So today we're going to focus a bit on, I guess, social and developmental both, I would say, psychology. And today's event will be moderated by one of our senior faculty, whom I'll introduce. And she will introduce Dr. Holub and Dr. Nelson, who will be giving the presentation today. So let me tell you about Dr. Owen. Dr. Owen's the Robinson Family Professor in the school in psychology in the School of Behavioral Brain Sciences. She's also the director of the Center for Children and Families. Got her bachelor's degree from Oberlin College, her master's from Kansas, and her PhD from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She's a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. Has won the Reuben Hill Award from the National Council on Family Relations, and won the Margaret Cohn Impact Award of the Dallas Association for the Education of Young Children. She's very much focused and very renowned for her work on parent-child and caregiver-child interactions, and young children's development in the context of those interactions. Currently, she's working on all sorts of developmental projects having to do with preparedness of children for school, and she's doing that in communities of indigent communities and communities that don't have English as their native language. And she's built an enormous research project and caring project, altruistic project for the community in those areas. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Owen up to the podium here, and she will introduce our speakers. Thank you so much for coming.
Off of this stage. So thank you, Dean Small. And I want to say it is my pleasure to serve as moderator for tonight's Brain Matters, and to introduce 2 very close colleagues of mine who will be our speakers this evening. Dr. Shayla Holub has been on the faculty at UT Dallas since 2005. She came shortly after receiving her PhD in psychology from Bowling Green State University. Her program of research investigates how parents socialize their children's eating habits and how their feeding practices with their children are associated with the eating habits that their children develop, how their kids eat. She also relates how parents' feeding practices relate to, she also researches how parents' feeding practices relate to their children's health. In addition, Dr. Holub studies children's attitudes about body shape and size, and this includes the early development of body image and weight prejudice. You can ask her about this. Dr. Jackie Nelson is also an associate professor of psychology here, like Dr. Holub, and She currently serves as the Associate Area Head for Psychology. Dr. Holub serves as our Area Head for Psychology, and she has served in that position for 7 years. Dr. Nelson has been on the faculty since 2011, shortly after she received her PhD in, Human Development and Family Studies from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Nelson's research examines parent-child conflict interactions and how mothers' and fathers' stressful experiences throughout the day impact how families interact with one another, with each other, and with their children. She also investigates children's social-emotional development, focusing on how parents interact with their children around the emotions that they are feeling. Doctors Nelson and Holub are wonderful teachers and mentors of their students here at UT Dallas. They've both received the Augie Moeller Teaching Award from the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, one of our highest awards. They're both faculty affiliates of the Center for Children and Families, and representing the center, they frequently share their knowledge on child development with parents, teachers, educators, and practitioners in the community. They're currently working closely together on a research project called the Healthy Families Project, in which they're examining parents' daily stressors, the emotional climate around mealtime, and parents' feeding practices with their preschool-aged children. So it's only fitting to have them present together tonight on family food fights. Now, the plan for this evening is to first have Dr. Holub speak, and then to have Dr. Nelson speak. And then we will entertain questions from all of you, and I'll walk around to make sure that we can hear you. And we'll share questions, exchange questions and answers for a little bit, but then we can do more of that outside at the reception, outside these doors. So, Dr. Holub, join me in welcoming her.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I know it's a rainy night and it's hard to get out, and we very much appreciate it. So I'm really happy to be here today to share with you some of the research that we're doing here at UT Dallas, as well as some of the research that we're building that research on. I hope that if you're a student or a community member, that regardless, you bring home one piece of information that you learned that you didn't know before, and that if you're a parent or a caregiver of a young child, that you bring home one practical tip that you can use and that you find helpful. So that's our goal for this evening. So let me set the stage by just reminding us about the problem of childhood obesity. So a recent UNICEF report came out that suggests that the proportion of overweight children has risen quite substantially between 2000 and 2016, with now 1 in 5 children globally being considered overweight or obese. And within this UNICEF report, they break it down by over 40 countries. And if you look at this report, it suggests that the United States prevalence is about 40% are classified as overweight and obese, and that this has increased pretty dramatically, 50% since 1990. So that's pretty striking. Most researchers think that we might have hit sort of a plateau in this country, but what I think is really important for us to recognize is that in countries around the world, that even though the obesity rates are lower, so for example in Turkey, right now the rates of overweight and obesity are about 30%, there has been an 151% increase since 1990. So we can think about what it is that might be accounting for these increases. And part of it is the Western ideas and the way of living that goes into these countries, and part of it also is a question of partly socioeconomic disadvantage. So I also want us to remember that this is not only a global issue, that this is an issue facing children in our own community. These are obesity rates that are taken from the ABC or Beyond ABC study done annually by Children's Health. And as you can see, we have a pretty high proportion of 3rd through 12th graders who are listed as overweight and obese. And of course, this also is tied to various counties, with some counties having higher rates than others. Again, likely tied to socioeconomic disadvantages. And there are numerous health-related complications that are connected to obesity, right? So children who are overweight, and these can be health-related complications that come concurrently or that happen in the future, but they're more at risk for cardiovascular concerns, for type 2 diabetes, for sleep apnea, for orthopedic concerns, as well as a whole host of psychosocial sort of outcomes. So increased rates of depression and increased potential for victimization due to the biases associated with being overweight. So I think there's this inclination, right? I know this chart is scary, but there's this inclination that people are overweight because they take in a certain amount of food, and that amount of food is greater than the amount of energy that they expend, right? That's the energy expenditure equation. But the thing is, overweight is more complicated than that. In fact, researchers have found they found hundreds, if not 1,000, different reasons that are related to contributing factors that are related to overweight and obesity. I like this model because it reminds us of the different spheres of influence. So if you look right here in the center of this model, this says cell. I know it's hard to read, but it reminds us that part of why some people are overweight is because of biological disposition toward overweight. Our genes contribute to the types of food we eat, they contribute to our types of activity levels that we have, and it also contributes to how our bodies store food. In addition, the next sphere is the child sphere. So this is a sphere that looks at child characteristics associated with overweight and obesity. So for example, children who are worse at global regulation, self-regulation, right, who have more challenges in self-regulation, are more prone to obesity and overweight. The next sphere is the family sphere, the clan sphere, right? So here we're really thinking about the types of feeding practices that parents use, the ways that parents socialize children to either be physically active or allowing children to spend all their time on video games. Those things that happen at the family level go into that sphere. The next sphere of influence that contribute to obesity are the community sphere. So for our kiddos, the community sphere is really school and peers, right? Sort of thinking about those contexts, right? So if our children are around peers who are eating more unhealthy foods, right? That's going to impact the types of foods that our kiddos eat. If our kids go to schools that have cut recess, that's so funny. They cut recess and don't have fun things for kids to play with at PE, right? That also is going to be contributing to our both energy intake and our physical activity. The next sphere of influence is really looking at country related. So this is state and national characteristics that might be associated. So are we in a state where we have federally mandated or state mandated physical activity rules or nutrition education things? Are we going through a national recession where some families are even more disadvantaged when it comes to the types of foods that I have available, what our country subsidizes, so what foods are more cheap than others? And then last but not least is the cultural level of influence. So this includes the sort of cultural values and belief systems that contribute to whether or not someone's physically active or whether or not they eat certain foods, and also to overweight. So examples of this might be gender role expectations for the types of foods that people should eat, right? Or gender role expectations for physical activity. It also includes the bias that individuals who are overweight are faced with, right? Because we know that cultural bias can be linked up to experiencing more victimization, which can be linked up to greater weight gain. So let me go back to this and say this is overwhelming. So as a researcher who thinks about this stuff every single day, I worry because I can't touch all these factors, and I can't understand all of these factors, and I can't put all these factors in one study. But what I can do as a social developmental psychologist is to think about a couple of these spheres of influence. So I focused my research really on the child sphere and on the clan sphere, the family sphere. So today what I want to do is talk about the family sphere, the importance of family in protecting children from obesity and promoting healthy eating habits in children. So parents play a really important role, and there are numerous ways that parents play a role, but here's a few that I wanted to share. So first, parents provide the food environment for the child, right? So the foods that are available in the home, although those are going to be constrained by economics, right? But the foods that are readily available in the home, whether parents are selecting fruits and vegetables, whether they're taking the time to chop those up and make them accessible to their kids, whether they create a variety of foods in their diets, all of those are going to impact feeding practices. And some of our work suggests that when parents have a more varied food environment in their household, that kids are less likely to show food neophobia, right? Which means that they're less likely to be fearful of trying new foods, right? And then because they're less fearful of trying new foods, they're also less picky in their eating. Parents also teach children about food. So babies are born with an innate preference for sweet tastes, and that allows them and encourages them to take in breast milk. So that's a good thing, right? But they still have that preference for sweets. And so we as parents have to teach children about the importance of taking in other types of foods. Vegetables have a bitter taste, right? But they're really important for our diets to maintain health. So parents can teach about the importance of specific foods, how to make meals that are healthy. We can teach them about how to choose foods in different settings to make sure we're making healthy choices. Those are sort of the overt ways that parents can teach about nutrition. But we can also teach about nutrition in more covert ways, right? We teach about nutrition all the time when we include our children in food preparation, right? When we make foods preparation fun, well, what that does is actually encourages more healthy food intake and encourages children to be more efficacious in feeling like they can themselves make healthy food selections. It's actually a really good predictor, right? So one of those things to take home with you, right? Involving your child in food prep is really important. Even though it is messy and it takes more time, it has some clear advantages. Another way that we teach kids about foods is through our own modeling. Do we eat those foods? And if we eat those foods, do we eat them enthusiastically? Research sort of talks about enthusiastic modeling. Broccoli, I love this broccoli. And research suggests that that makes a big impact in the way that kids eat, right? So that's one important lesson that we can learn, is that thinking about the way that we ourselves are modeling food intake. And last but not least, I want to talk a little bit, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the specific way that parents socialize kids' eating behaviors through our food parenting. So you might ask, what is food parenting, right? What is that? So food parenting includes the specific practices that parents engage in around feeding. So do they use pressure? Do they try to use food as a reward? Are they restricting their child's food intake? And another aspect of food parenting is parent feeding style. So parent feeding style is, the sort of approach they take to feeding. They sort of laissez-faire, no, anything goes, whatever you want, or are they more controlling in their style? And then another aspect of food parenting is our general parenting style. So how do we approach our interactions with our children? An example of this, in my research lab, we did a study that looked at psychological control as a general parenting style. So parents who engage in psychological control are more likely to use guilt and shame and love withdrawal to try to get their children to think and feel the way that they do, right? And what we found was that when parents engage in more psychological control, it's actually related to more controlling feeding practices. Psychological control was not only related to more feeding practices, but it was also linked up directly to food over responsiveness and emotional eating in children. So this model reminds us that all three of these types of food parenting are related to children's eating and activity behaviors as well as their weight status. And this side of the model is important too, right? That these influences also come from the child. So children's weight will impact the way that we parent them around food, as well as their eating behaviors will also impact, right? These are transactional relationships. If a child is acting more responsive to food, then we're going to engage in a feeding practice in relation to that responsiveness, and then that feeding practice will impact the child, and it goes back and forth in sort of a dance over time. So I think it's important for us to recognize that one of the ways that we can really keep kiddos healthy around food and to maximize our food-related parenting is to take a division of responsibility in feeding. So division of responsibility in feeding suggests that parents are responsible for what kids should be eating, for when kids are eating, because we have to socialize them so that when they go to school, they know they can't get a snack every 5 minutes, right? So we have to teach them about meal timings, and then also where they eat. So we make decisions about, do they eat at the table as a family? Do we let them eat in front of the TV? What are the consequences of that? And the reason why we as parents and caregivers should be responsible for the what of eating is because children are still learning about nutrition. And one research project that we did, we allowed 4 to 6-year-olds to create meals that were healthy, unhealthy, and then their most liked meal. And kids were pretty good at coming up with this prototypical unhealthy meal, right? They took all the sweet foods, all the desserts, and they put them on one plate. But when it came to the prototypical healthy meal, children had a much harder time. So what they did was they selected individually healthy foods. They selected all fruits and vegetables. And those foods themselves are healthy, but if you put them together, they don't give you the nutrients to really help you grow and help your brain function and help you have the energy that you need, right? So they're still learning about what makes a healthy meal and that we need dietary variety. In addition, when we asked them about their most liked foods, they chose things like mac and cheese, potato chips, strawberries, which gives me some glimmer of hope, right? Cookies and pizza. And so their preferences are also not necessarily for foods that are always healthy, which is another reason why we're responsible for what we lay out on the table for them. So if we're responsible for the what, when, and where, what are kids responsible for? Well, they're responsible for how much and whether they should eat that food, okay? And this is hard, right? And I'm going to go into that. But this is the reason why they should be responsible for how much. If we let them determine how much to eat or whether to eat, we will encourage them to listen to their cues of hunger and fullness. And if we let them listen to their cues, what we found from research is they're actually pretty good at doing this. Most of us adults in this room no longer do this, right? If you eat a lot, you tend to just eat more, right? But kiddos are pretty good at this, and we know this through experimental work. So for example, if I give most preschoolers a high-calorie snack before a meal, right, they'll actually eat less at their meal. And if I give them a low-calorie snack, they'll eat more at the meal, right? And some of you are probably like, I've seen preschoolers eat. That doesn't make sense. Well, preschoolers are fairly erratic in their eating behavior at individual meals, right? So sometimes they eat a lot, sometimes they eat a little. But research has found that if you look across about a 30-hour window, that kids actually eat around the same number of calories in 30 hours, right? Kind of this idea that they know how much to eat and they're eating a consistent amount, even if we as parents think that they're not eating anything at all, right? And so they are pretty good at self-regulation. So we want to let them be responsible for that as long as they can, and that will help to maintain healthy eating. And like I said, I know this is hard, right? And if you think, oh, that academic standing up there, she just doesn't know what real life is like. No, I do. I do, because I have 2 young children, right? So I know it's hard because we work really hard at making meals and then our kids refuse, right? They don't want to eat it, right? And that's a challenge. And research suggests that food refusal is fairly common, especially when kids are trying new foods. And so research actually says that kids, to eat a brand new food that might look something like they don't want to eat, right, might take up to 8 to 15 taste exposures, right? And that's a lot of exposures. Right, that they would have to try it 8 to 15 times in order to accept that food. Most parents give up somewhere between 3 and 5 times, right? And so we might not keep making that veggie lasagna because they're not going to eat it anyway. Well, it might be that it just will take them a little bit longer. And we can do things, I don't really advocate tricking our children, but we can do things to make foods interesting, right? There's nothing wrong with giving children condiments that they really like, so if it's ranch dressing or ketchup, and if they want to dip that new food into that because that helps them get a taste exposure, fine, right? In my house, we do things that encourage healthy food intake by making it playful, right? So my kids will close their eyes and they'll say, we want to play a taste test. And I'll ask them questions like, okay, so can you taste the difference between the dark green lettuce and the light green lettuce? And before you know it, they are eating tons and tons of lettuce. So we're going to make food interesting. Controlling feeding practices do not support the division of responsibility in feeding. So we've got some experimental research that backs this up. So feeding for emotion regulation in our lab, we had children watch happy and sad clips and neutral clips from the Lion Guard. And we found that when we then gave them food directly after it, they actually ate more chocolate in response to sad foods. Okay? We also know from experimental research on restriction that if you have both apple cookies and peach cookies, and kids like them equally well, and then you take away the apple cookies for some time, and then you bring them back, suddenly they only like the apple cookies and they don't like the peach cookies. So restricting foods, taking them away, also seems to be problematic. In addition, pressuring children to eat more foods. So if I say something like, here's red soup and yellow soup, and I make the children eat more of the yellow soup, suddenly they don't like the yellow soup. So our controlling feeding practices is actually backfire. So I spent a lot of time on my research really looking at not just the experimental work, but also thinking about how these feeding practices play out in the real world. So one of the studies that we did looked at parents' practice of feeding for emotion regulation. And what we found was that parents who are more prone to emotional eating actually tend to use emotion regulation practices more often, and then that was tied to children's emotional eating, right? So here we can sort of take away that this feeding practice, right, that parents are using because they may not have the coping skills they need to manage their own emotion, is sort of indirectly causing children to also eat more healthily by encouraging emotional eating. In the same way, we've done some studies with restriction in our lab, and we found that, so in this study, what we did was we had parents and children eat a meal together, and then we had them play for 10 minutes in a playtime session together, and then we had a chime ring, and in this playtime session, I should say that there were snacks available and also some toys and games to play with. And then the parents left after 10 minutes when a chime rang. And what we found, what we were looking for, is whether or not parents actually used restriction, right, with their kids, whether they said, you can't have this food, and then to see their response, and then to look at children's eating in the absence of hunger afterwards. And what we found was that restriction worked when parents were present, right? So if parents said, no more, you can't have any more of that food, kids listened for the most part, right? But as soon as the kids left the room, they were more likely to, or as soon as the parents left the room, then the kids overindulged. In fact, one child put a bunch of cookies in his pockets and then hid under the table and ate them, right? So restriction seems to backfire because it encourages children not to listen to their internal cues of hunger and satiety. So we've been doing some new research, and I may be running out of time to talk about that today. So I'm going to go ahead and just skip this.
Okay.
Okay, so should I just talk a little bit about it?
Sure.
Just set the stage?
Sure.
So I'm going to set the stage for Jackie because I got my time signal. So I'm really excited to share this work, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it in the questions. So Q, here's a question I really want you to ask. So we've been working on this really great study where we've been starting to look at how these feeding practices take it out of the experiment, take it out of the lab, and start to look at a large number of families from our community. And so these families were involved in a pretty intensive study where we gave them an initial survey where they talked about, told us about their families, told us about their kids, told us about their general parenting. And then we gave them 7 days of dinner time recordings. So we actually took a GoPro into their home and asked them to to record their dinners. And we have several RAs who are now looking at all those videos. Wave if you're one of those RAs, looking at all of those videos, encoding that behavior, and trying to look for the types of feeding practices that parents are engaging in mealtime context, and also emotional climate around meals. We also had parents do 7 days of daily diaries. So they told us about the stress of the day, how they ate, how their children ate during the day, and also the feeding practices they used, as well as a behavioral assessment of eating in the absence of hunger. And so we had a wide range, a fairly diverse sample, although not necessarily a sample at risk. And I am really excited to tell you more about those study findings after Jackie Nelson gives her talk. So thank you, and I'm going to just, so parents are important. Sorry that I lost track of time. Okay.
All right, good evening. The second half, the second presentation in this series is how families members can come together to promote health and harmony. Okay, I will get to Healthy Families Project results, but I want to start by talking about family stress more broadly. So family stress is the real or perceived imbalance between the demands that a family faces and the resources they have to face that challenge. Family stressors can be acute in the sense that it might be an event that happens once, or they might be more chronic. It might be marital conflict that happens day in and day out. We typically, when we're thinking about stress, we're typically thinking about distress, which is a negative psychological response to a stressor. But stress might also be stemming from a positive event, a new birth in the family, where we experience a positive psychological response to that stressor, eustress, but it still requires adaptation on the part of the family. Here are the most common family stressors. In fact, if we survey adults, in general, not just parents, we find that money is the #1 stressor that people report. Other common family stressors are kids' behaviors, my relationship with my partner, and the work I do outside and inside the home. Okay, the human body is designed to experience stress and to react to it. Our body's stress response system keeps us alert and ready to avoid danger. It is adaptive. Problems arise when a person faces continuous challenges without periods of rest and recovery. This amounts to continuous hits on that stress response system that can lead to wear and tear and health problems over time. This, according to the American Psychological Association, these are the most common effects of stress on our body and our behavior. In my lab, we look at how stress affects parenting behaviors, how we interact with our kids. And we often find that when you experience more stress, no surprise, you're less patient, less emotionally responsive, you're more negative in your interactions towards your kids. Some parents respond to stress by withdrawing from family interaction, but that does tend to be more common among fathers than mothers. Children experience stress. They actually report experiencing more stress than we as parents or teachers think they experience. And here are some common behavioral symptoms of children's stress. Increased behavior problems, a lack of impulse control and attention, memory impairments, both in terms of working memory and long-term memory, infections, as well as exacerbation of chronic illnesses, and sleep problems, which unfortunately lead to more behavior problems. All right, we all experience stress though, so how do we cope with stress? American Psychological Association has recommendations for that. First, they suggest that parents model healthy behaviors, like Dr. Holub mentioned. Model healthy behaviors, model healthy coping strategies for kids. Another recommendation is to talk to kids about stress. Ask them if something's worrying them or bothering them and how you might help them work through that problem. Sometimes children, especially young children, have difficulty identifying what it is they're feeling about a stressor or a transition in their lives. APA also recommends that we don't forget about self-care as we're dealing with stressors. That also, if we do that as parents, models good coping strategies for kids. They suggest that we change one habit at a time. If we want to make a healthy change in our life, don't try to change every single thing we do in our families. We focus on one thing this week, and we're likely to be more effective. And finally, what I want to focus on today is this idea that if we create a clear and relaxing space that we live in, that can help alleviate stress. Okay, so one specific family stressor is home chaos. This is disorganization, a lack of routine, a lack of order in the family. This picture I just got from the internet, so it's clearly a staged picture, but I think it's a nice illustration of home chaos. We've got clutter, we've got a lack of cleanliness, difficulty staying on time and being prepared for the day. We even have electronic intrusions with the cell phone that contribute to family chaos. Okay, we often study home chaos in our lab, and what we find is that when parents report experiencing more chaos, they also report having more punitive responses to their kids' negative emotions, being less effective in their discipline practices, their children complying less to what they'd like them to do, and when we do have conflict interactions with our kids, those being more hostile in nature. You can imagine what this feels like, and then having to be patient and responsive with your kids and how that might affect your interactions. Home chaos is related to family income, but it's also distinct. I'll talk about that more in a couple slides, the challenges of families living in poverty related to home chaos and family routine. But these are distinct concepts. They're not the same thing. So many middle-income and high-income families experience chaos and disorganization, and low-income families can't implement good routines to try to stick to a schedule. There's a gendered nature to home chaos, in that mothers tend to be more responsible for managing children's days and managing how the day is going to go and things are going to be run in the household. So we do find in our research that home chaos tends to be a more salient stressor for mothers than fathers. So in other words, it has more of a negative impact on moms. Okay, so what I want to shift gears to next is just the opposite of what we were just talking about. One way we can manage that chaos is by implementing routines in our families. These can include children's self-care activities. They can include family time that we share together. They can include playtime, and hopefully they do include some playtime. Routines provide structure that have many benefits for kids. Even very young children want to have control and agency in their environment. Do you know any 2-year-olds? I have one. Me do it, right? They want to have control over their environment, and having a predictable routine where they know what to expect next helps enable them to have some control over that environment. It also provides opportunities for kids to practice self-regulation as they follow the next direction in that routine sequence. And that has important implications for school readiness too, right? Because when they transition to school, they're going to have a lot more behavioral demands and structure on their day. Okay, so this is some research looking at family routines and benefits for kids. Family routines, this idea that like we have a set of things we do in the morning time to get ready for the day, and then we have a set routine for mealtime, for bedtime, we read stories, we get our jammies on, things like that, right? We find that these family routines are associated with better health outcomes for kids and better social emotional adjustment. So for health, some studies I pulled here to demonstrate this, that when there's a good family routine in place, kids have better sleep quality. And one study is also found here that I pulled about better asthma control. So we also might have better control of our chronic illnesses when we have a routine. Family routines have been associated with better self-regulation in kids. So that's both better impulse control and our ability to control our negative emotions. Okay, so let's revisit this idea that sticking to a routine can be harder when you live in poverty. Low-income families experience more stress and thus have to improvise more to face the challenges of the day. Many low-income families are headed by single mothers who have maybe less help and support in caring for their kids. Low-income parents are also more likely to work non-standard work shifts or to piece together part-time employment, which means that their days literally may be different, their schedules may be different from one day to the next. If their work schedules are different, that means their childcare arrangements might be different from one day to the next too. That makes it difficult to stick to a set routine each day. Finally, kids in poverty are at greater risk for having poor regulatory skills because of all the stressors that they experience. And if your child has poor regulatory skills, they're less likely to comply with the routine that you want them to follow. Okay, so there are some challenges, but Research shows that low-income kids are especially likely to benefit from a good routine. Some research shows that low-income children benefit much more than middle or higher-income children from having a good routine in place in the family, having that extra structure. So for example, in one study of low-income toddlers, family routines fostered greater self-regulation at age 2 and greater cognitive ability 1 year later, even after accounting for their routine at that later time point. So there was something special about having a good, solid routine in the family early on that had long-term benefits for kids. In another study, family routine diminished the impact of financial hardship on inner-city African-American adolescents in terms of their behavior problems, their academic engagement, and their GPA. Okay, so that's routines in general. Sorry, let's get specific about one aspect of our routine, our mealtime routine, and that's where we'll visit some of the research that Dr. Holub and I have been working on. Mealtime is a stressor that parents of young children frequently report. They actually say it's one of the most stressful parts of their day, feeding my child. It also, if we're looking at dinners in particular, this is a time when the stress from the day may be spilling over to affect the quality of those family interactions. However, mealtimes are an important context for shared family time, for connection with family members, and parenting behaviors at dinner have broad implications for children's health, as Dr. Holub shared with us. So that's why we're interested in looking at these routines specifically. Okay, I'll start with the fact that mealtime routines have been shown to benefit children's health in a number of ways. So for example, both studies with very young children and with adolescents show that when families eat more dinners together throughout the week, those children consume more fruits and vegetables compared to kids whose families do not often eat dinners together. Why is this the case? Why do we see these positive? And there's other positive health benefits here listed as well. Why? Because parents have more control over the mealtime context, like Dr. Holub described to us. So they have more control over what their children are eating because they're serving the food. They can model healthy behaviors for kids. They can connect and relate to their children. They can also identify any problematic eating behaviors right then at the time because they're able to observe their eating more frequently. However, this body of research shows that when the TV is on, these benefits are diminished on children's health. So if the TV's on, we might be watching TV, so we're not communicating and connecting with one another. We might be passively eating while we're watching, so we're not focusing on what we're doing, we're not listening to our body's cues. And research shows that even if the TV's on in the background, even if we're not watching it, that background noise influences how much we talk to each other. So we communicate with each other less, with our children less, even if there's background noise on. We ran into this problem with, in my family, I have a 2- and a 4-year-old. They love to listen to music at dinner. Really, they love to bark orders at Alexa and get a response back right away. But it was fun at first. We'd all sing songs together. But when you want to sing all dinner, every dinner, you quickly realize that we're not talking to each other. We're not connecting. I'm not hearing about your day. And we're actually not focused on the task at hand, which is eating. And for young kids, that distraction can really throw things off. Okay, in addition to the health benefits of shared family meals, these opportunities also allow families to emotionally connect, to socialize children, so teach them about the world and create those teaching moments. And research has even shown that it provides an opportunity to expand young children's vocabulary through the family discussions that we have during those meals. Okay, I'd like to show you a clip of a family's meal. They have consented to you watching this clip. It's cute. There's nothing to criticize here. It's a really sweet clip from our Healthy Families project that Dr. Holub started to describe to you. This is a mealtime observation study. So let's watch this family for a few minutes.
Eat this fish like chicken macaroni and cheese and cucumber.
Today we continued our health club theme. We started our morning with a song called This Is My Body. How does that song go?
Here's my body. Here's my body. I only have one. I only have one. And this is my body. This is my body. That's how it goes.
Cool, I like that song. It helps teach children that we only have one body and we have to take care of it. We reviewed ways to take care of our bodies like taking a bath, brushing our teeth, going to the doctor, eating healthy, and exercise. Do you do all that?
Uh-huh.
Do you brush your teeth?
Uh-huh.
Do you take a bath?
Yeah.
Do you go to the doctor?
Mhm.
Do you exercise?
Uh-huh.
Do you eat healthy?
Yeah. And what exercise? If you eat sport, that's exercising. And we're exercising.
Oh, right. Going outside playing soccer or basketball, that's exercising. Today we completed a mini book about my body. The children made a self-portrait. We took their height and weight and they completed their mini books. We did an activity called Let's Get Moving. We did 7 different exercises and stretches in a circle for 1 minute. In the evening we practiced our fire drill and had the children learn how to jump using jump ropes? What?
I meant to tell you that. Mommy, have you ever jumped rope before?
I did, I have. I can still do it now, I think.
I'm still good at it.
You're still good at it? When I was a little girl,
I'm so angry. I keep dropping things. I'm so angry.
it's okay, it's no big deal.
No, I keep dropping things and I eat things.
It's all cool in the hood. We got more silverware, it's no big deal.
Okay, good.
You're welcome. So when I was a little girl, listen to this. They had a jump rope contest. See how many times you could jump rope. And people would give you money.
I asked Teddy if she wanted to jump rope 10 times, but she didn't.
That's okay.
Okay. All right, so I like that interaction for a number of reasons. Mom is supportive, she's engaged with her child. They have a nice routine of talking about his day and sharing experiences with one another. She even helps him regulate his anger, right, when he drops his fork. If she hadn't been there at dinner, that might have looked very different. He was able to jump right in and say, it's okay, it's no big deal, we've got lots of forks, it's all right. This family environment was rated by our trained coders as low on home chaos, so we are observationally rating chaos. But our coding's not complete yet to analyze data on this for our entire sample. I can tell you from our parent self-reports on chaos across the 100 moms in our sample who reported their experiences for 7 consecutive days across the week, that on days when mothers perceived the home environment to be more chaotic than usual, they also reported reacting more negatively towards their children in response to stress on those same days, more negatively than they typically would. They also reported on days when they reported more home chaos, they reported feeding their children to be more challenging on those days. So they perceived that this is harder to get through this meal, to get through this day, harder than it usually is when I have a more chaotic day. And this is after accounting for family income and children's BMI percentile. After our observational coding of chaos is complete in the spring, we look forward to comparing parents' perceptions of chaos to our observational ratings. Generally, research suggests that people's perceptions of stress are what are most important. But it will be interesting to examine why some parents have greater tolerance for chaos than others. So maybe they report not having a very chaotic environment, but when we observe it, our objective raters have a much different perception. Have you maybe experienced that in your own life? You had a past roommate or a partner who has a much higher tolerance for chaos than you did. Things could be messy and cluttered and they thought it was fine and it really stressed you out. So that's something we can explore. Okay, before I share some tips, I want to just acknowledge the fact that children can contribute to chaos. I don't mean to end on a mean note here, but I like to acknowledge this because the family we just watched just had the one kid. We have some families in our study that have 5 or 6 kids, and it can be more challenging to manage that routine and stick to a good mealtime routine when we have a number of children in the home. Children can contribute to chaos primarily via a lack of compliance. However, we can encourage children to comply with our family routine by providing clear, simple instructions with eye contact, maybe even providing pictures of the day's routine that children can follow as they go along. Parents also need to be patient with kids. Research shows that parents often interrupt the child with a second request or a follow-up demand before they have time to comply with the first instruction. So they are putting down their tasks they're working on, they're shifting gears, those executive function skills that are still developing as they are now going to listen to your request to come to the dinner, and they already are getting, why haven't you gotten here yet? What are you doing? Follow-up demands and more requests. So give them a little time to comply. Okay, I'll wrap up here by providing some tips for how to create that health and harmony in the family, which is what we're talking about today. Many of these I've already mentioned, but just to reiterate, we can plan family meals ahead of time. Don't make the mistake I do at 6 p.m. when you want to have dinner served at 6:10 and you don't know how that's going to happen, right? If you want to have, especially the healthy meals that Dr. Holland talked to us about, getting kids involved, plan ahead. That can help limit that chaos and stress. Identify roles. If you have another adult that you co-parent with, you can talk with them ahead of time about what each person's role is in that routine and getting things ready. Your children can have important roles in preparing food for the meal. Set clear expectations for kids that are developmentally appropriate, that they can follow. Be consistent in your routine. That's how we create the routine, right? That's how it becomes clear to a child something that they can expect if it's consistent from day to day, and also if it's consistent from one caregiver to the next. This is where this gets tricky. If kids spend a couple days each week with grandma and the routine at her house is quite different than the routine at your house, that can create some challenges. So that as much as we can, trying to be consistent across caregivers in the routine we'd like to stick to. Don't overschedule. So when we talk about a routine, you often imagine maybe lots of different things packed in during the day. This is a mistake that many middle and high-income families make, where they think that overscheduling, packing as many things as possible, as many enrichment activities as possible into one day is what's best for my child's development. Remember that kids need time to rest and relax just like you do, and they need time to play, which, by the way, is an important learning context for kids if they're able to have time to play. Turn off those electronics, the TV, the music, your cell phones. Research on screen time shows that when parents are on their cell phones, they are essentially breaking that emotional connection with your child, and they pick up on that. And then finally, even though I've spent 20 minutes talking about routines, sometimes we need to throw routines out the window and be flexible, especially in times of transition and times of extra stress. Trying to force a routine can sometimes create more stress and chaos if we need to be flexible. So for example, your child is sick today and he doesn't want to sit and eat dinner with the rest of the family. He wants to rest on the couch. That's fine, right? So being flexible as well. Okay, the last thing I'd like to do is, on behalf of Shayla as well, is thank you all for being here on this rainy evening. We want to thank funding sources. We also, of course, want to thank our families who participate in this research, who made all of this possible, generously providing their time, and the research assistants, graduate and undergraduate students from past and present who have worked on these projects, who, for this Healthy Families project, drove all around DFW to meet families at their homes and now are deep in their computers, coding all of these interactions. So thank you very much. And now we can hand it over to our moderator to answer questions. Thanks.
For a few questions. Yes, run right here. Great.
Hi. I actually have 2 questions, but one for each of you, but I'll ask Jackie her questions. My question first for her. My name is Jackie also.
Oh, good.
Okay. Under one of your titles, Poverty and Routine, you had African American Adolescents' Behavior and Academic Adjustment. So does your research show that poverty affects the eating habits of African American adolescents more so than other races?
This
Oh,
was not one of my studies, but what this research was showing was that the negative effects of, the negative impact of poverty was diminished, so it was lessened for these adolescents when there was a good family routine in the home. So in other words, a family routine was very protective for those adolescents in terms of them being, having fewer problem behaviors, being more engaged at school, and having higher GPA.
Okay, but my question is, does it affect African American adolescents more than Caucasians and Asians and other teenagers? Does poverty affect their eating habits and health more so than other races? Based on your research, based on your topic, you had adolescents, African American adolescents under that title. So my thinking is that poverty may affect all races in the same way, but your research may show that it doesn't, that it affect African American adolescents different based on how you had that title listed. So that's what I was wondering.
Oh, no, I see what you mean. No, that was just one specific study that was looking at a certain group of adolescents. The study I presented right before that about the low-income toddlers, that was low-income toddlers from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. So it was just one example, but it wasn't suggesting that was only the case among African American adolescents, or that, yeah.
That would be a good research study, yes.
Thank you.
I have a question about bias. How do y'all control for bias when y'all are coding? Sometimes, if it's very apparent that the family in the video is in a lower SES bracket, it might bias us to code them as being more chaotic, etc. How do you control for that?
Yeah, that's a great question, a great methodological question. And we have a number of our coders and coder trainers here too. We do a lot of training for our coders ahead of time before they get started. We have groups of 3 coders on our teams typically. We have lots of different teams looking at different things. And each pair, so we have 3 coders and each pairing needs to be reliable with one another, and we have frequent coding meetings to talk through any of those discrepancies. And sometimes those biases do come up. What we've actually seen more so in our research lately with the coding is male and female research assistants seeing moms and dads' responsiveness and affect differently. So female RAs perceiving that dad is expressing more negative affect perhaps than the male RA perceives in that interaction. So we see some biases related to gender and parent gender too. But it's something that we talk through, we try to make extra notes in our coding manual, and we try to do the best that we can to work through those discrepancies. But you're absolutely right, it's a big challenge with observational coding.
And do you feel like you have a good diversity of SES and demographic background amongst your coders to help control for your biases?
I do believe that. I don't know. I know. No, it's a great point. To be honest, I can't say I'm real familiar with the socioeconomic background of my coders, but I do know we have a lot of racial and ethnic diversity in our coding team, and we have both males and females coding, like I mentioned. But the socioeconomic piece, I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you bring that up. It's just thinking about how someone's past experiences in their own family might bias how they see a low-income family. I think that's a great point.
And we do talk about that quite a lot. I know I had a coding meeting this week where there was sort of this expectation like, well, why are the parents doing that? Why is that? This doesn't seem right. And I sort of reminded them that, parents all have different goals for that interaction, which could come from their backgrounds, their families of origin, from their culture, from other things. And so we're always constantly trying to remind that and sort of, we don't want to say, don't speak what you're feeling, but also to think about those comments, right? And make sure that we're not being biased.
I would just say also that we're very fortunate that the students at UT Dallas are very diverse. And so we have all kinds of students to choose from and all kinds of backgrounds, and that's wonderful. Yeah. Way over there. Come on over this way.
Were there any of the families, hi, how are you, that had multiple generations in the home?
So for our study, we were really hoping to have even more diverse sort of family units, right? So we really said that in order to participate in the study, we needed a primary caregiver, and then anyone that is sort of a co-parent, a co-feeder with that child, right? And so we were hopeful that we would have more diverse family units, and in the end, didn't have as much diversity. So we do have several instances in our videos where there's still sort of the traditional mother as a caregiver and then a partner, and then we also have influences of others like a grandmother and those sorts of things, but we're not specifically yet coding those behaviors and how that influences. But those are the next steps. So we're really sort of focusing on the questions we can answer right now, and then we know we probably have 20 years of, no, not 20 years of data. It feels like with this coding, but it feels like we could be coding some of these data for a long time for some really interesting, important questions.
I was actually just watching a family's video yesterday to show in my class, and we have 7 days from each family, so it was interesting to look at this family where the first couple days of mealtime, it was just the parents and the 2 kids, and then the subsequent days, grandma and grandpa were at the meal as well. Our coders are still coding for the same parent towards that target child behaviors, or parents towards each other with co-parenting or marital interactions. But that could be something really interesting to look at next, especially when we have those multiple days for the same families, how those dynamics change within that same family over time when other people join.
Yeah, I was just thinking the way my mother would feed my daughter, or
Yeah.
my father might feed my daughter, it's totally different time.
Yes, yeah. And that's a big challenge when we're talking about those mealtime routines too and feeding behaviors, that might, those
Well, and
contexts
that's
change.
there's been some research that comes out on like exclusive grandparent feeding, like grandparents as feeders in the home on a regular basis. So maybe the child's in grandparent care, and suggesting that that might also be a risk factor for overweight as well, because the types of feeding practices they use and the foods that they are providing.
So I have a question regarding future directions. I noticed that it was 100 families, correct? But I also heard that you guys said moms frequently, so were they 100 moms specifically?
Great question.
And as far as maybe incorporating more more males in
It's
future
almost
directions?
like Dr. Holub asked you to ask this question. No, I'm just kidding. That's exactly what the data that she didn't get to share.
Okay.
But we do. So we do have 100 families.
Yes.
Every family that we asked the primary caregiver to participate, and then most of those cases that was mom, and then in about 65 families, we have a second caregiver participate as well. So we've been able to run some dyadic models where we look at fathers' practices as well.
Yeah, so we're
I guess
really,
you just can't get like a perfect sample all the time, can we?
Yeah.
No, so that's, and I'm sorry that I couldn't share this information, but really, what I think is the benefit of this kind of analysis and sort of taking this work out of the lab and into the home is sort of thinking about how families work together, right? And so we were able to, for example, through these models, here these are sort of these complicated multilinear models that I'm not going to try to teach you in like 2 minutes, but basically what this suggests is, what is predicting here? So here, on average, mother's restriction is predicting, on average, less energy regulation. So when mothers use more restriction, kids have less energy regulation. And that's kind of in line with what past research has said. But what this also suggests for fathers feeding and use of restriction is that this is a level 1, which means on days when dads are being more restrictive, moms are reporting that the kids have better energy regulation. And in some ways that feels backwards, right? Because we were saying restriction is harmful. But what this might be saying is that fathers Don't use restriction a lot, but maybe when they step in, they're stepping in on a daily level to help. So when they're using more restriction, it's actually encouraging more healthy eating habits. And so that's why this is just looking at the daily diary reports. So next we can compare this with those really great observations we have to see this play out during that mealtime at that day. And so this is the kind of cool analyses that we're trying to figure out. How do these parents work together? And what I think is also really interesting, we've done this for all of the feeding practices, but also just how do parents co-parent together around feeding? And we found that in their daily reports, parents say that co-parenting around food is much harder than co-parenting in other domains. So parents struggle with working together. So in this case, I'm hoping that it looks like maybe fathers are stepping in when kids need a little bit more support, but we will be able to see that through these observations, whether they're actually working together effectively.
Can we say thank you again? We're going to break and go outside, and you can ask more questions then. And you received an evaluation form, so please fill it out because we want your feedback, we want your suggestions, and we thank you all very much for coming. And take your questions out there. Thanks.